They were already pulling her bag out of the overhead bin when the captain said it. "Ma'am, you need to move, now." The aisle froze. The low hum of the auxiliary power unit filled the silence, steady and mechanical, like a heart that didn't care who it was keeping alive. A grey-haired man in a tailored blazer half rose from his seat, then sat back down. A woman near the window pressed her lips together, eyes darting away, pretending to read. No one intervened. No one ever did at moments like this. The woman they were standing over did not look angry. She did not look scared. She looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the early hour. Her hands rested flat on her knees, palms down, as if grounding herself. She was black, late 50s, dressed in a plain navy sweater and dark slacks. No jewelry worth mentioning, no designer bag. Just a worn leather tote at her feet, scuffed at the corners, like it had been places most people never saw. Captain Daniel Hargrove stood over her seat, broad shoulders filling the narrow aisle. 63. Former Air Force. The kind of man who had spent a lifetime being obeyed before he finished speaking. His jaw was clenched, eyes cool, professional, already past the point of discussion. To him, this was a correction, a necessary adjustment, the sort of thing that kept flights smooth and clients happy. "I'm not asking," he said, quieter now, which somehow made it worse. "I'm telling you." She looked up at him slowly, not startled, not defiant, just attentive, like someone listening for the truth behind the words. "I paid for this seat," she said. Her voice was calm, low, the kind of calm that unsettles people who expect either gratitude or panic. "If there's a problem, I'd like to understand it." Hargrove exhaled through his nose. He glanced back toward the front of the cabin, where a man in his mid-60s sat with his arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the exchange. William and Caroline Brooks, longtime clients. The kind who sent handwritten holiday cards to the company president. The kind who didn't complain loudly. They didn't have to. "The issue," Hargrove said, choosing each word carefully, "is that we have a seating conflict that needs to be resolved before departure." Her eyes flicked past him, just for a second. She noticed the flight attendant hovering near the galley, fingers knotted together, knuckles white. Emily. Young. Doing everything she had been trained to do, and still ending up here. "What kind of conflict," the woman asked, "requires me to move?" Hargrove didn't answer right away. He had learned long ago that silence could be a tool. He let it stretch, let the pressure build, trusting it to do the work for him. He had used it on junior officers, on nervous co-pilots, on executives who wanted explanations they didn't need. "This seat," he said finally, "is typically reserved." There it was. Not officially, not on paper, but typically, a word heavy with implication. "Reserved for whom?" she asked. Behind him, Caroline Brooks shifted in her seat. A soft sigh escaped her lips, just loud enough to be heard. William leaned toward her, murmured something under his breath. His tone wasn't angry. It was offended, as if a social contract had been violated, not by the captain, but by the woman who hadn't immediately stood up. Hargrove felt it then. The familiar irritation, the sense that time was being wasted, that authority was being questioned by someone who didn't understand how things worked. He straightened, tugged once at the cuff of his jacket. "We don't need to get into that," he said. "The simplest solution is for you to relocate to the lounge seating in the rear. You'll have more space, more privacy." Her mouth curved, just slightly. Not a smile, more like recognition. "And the people who want this seat," she said, nodding toward the Brookses without turning her head, "they'll be more comfortable." Hargrove hesitated. A fraction of a second. Enough. "This isn't personal," he said. She looked at him then, really looked at him, and something in her gaze shifted. Not anger, not hurt. Something sharper, something assessing. "It never is," she said. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. A man 2 rows back cleared his throat. Somewhere near the cockpit, a door closed with a soft click. Emily took a step forward before she could stop herself. Her voice trembled, but she spoke anyway. "Captain, her boarding confirmation lists this seat. There isn't an override logged. If we move her, we need—" "That's enough," Hargrove snapped, not turning around. The words landed hard. Final. Emily swallowed and stepped back, heat flooding her face. She stared at the carpet, ashamed and furious all at once. The woman in the seat watched the exchange closely. She noticed the way Emily's shoulders slumped, the way Hargrove didn't even acknowledge her presence afterward. She had seen this dynamic before. In boardrooms, in hospitals, in courtrooms where the outcome had been decided before anyone opened their mouth. She took a breath, slow, measured. "I'm willing to discuss options," she said. "But I'm not moving without documentation, a written request, a reason, and a name attached to it." That did it. Hargrove's expression hardened. The patience drained from his face, replaced by something colder. "Ma'am," he said, leaning in just enough for her to feel his presence. "This aircraft does not leave until all issues are resolved. I am responsible for that. If you continue to delay us, you put everyone's schedule at risk." There was a murmur now, low, uneasy, people shifting, glancing at their watches, their phones. No one said her name. No one asked what she did for a living. They had already decided who she was. She looked around the cabin, at the polished wood veneer, the soft leather seats, the men who had built careers in rooms that looked just like this one. She had sat across from men like them for decades, listening as they explained things she had already mastered. "Then, I suggest," she said quietly, "you put your request in writing. Because I won't be the only one reading it." Hargrove straightened. He felt it then. Not fear, not yet, but something like the first crack in ice. "This doesn't need to escalate," he said. "It already has," she replied. For a moment, no one moved. The engines outside ticked as they cooled. Somewhere on the tarmac, a vehicle passed, tires hissing against concrete. Time pressed in from all sides. William Brooks leaned forward, voice smooth, practiced. "Captain," he said, "perhaps we can speak privately." Hargrove nodded, grateful for the interruption, and stepped back toward the cockpit. As he did, his eyes lingered on the woman for half a beat longer than necessary. A look of final judgment, of dismissal. She watched him go, then bent down and picked up her tote. Her fingers brushed the worn leather, steadying her. Inside, beneath a stack of papers and a folded scarf, was a slim phone, already vibrating. She didn't answer it yet, not until the door to the cockpit closed, not until the cabin exhaled, not until the story everyone thought they were in was about to change. Captain Daniel Hargrove did not like being interrupted in his cockpit. He closed the door with deliberate care, sealing out the cabin noise, the murmurs, the tension that clung to the air like static. Inside, the space was tight, familiar, filled with the quiet authority of switches and screens. This was where things made sense. This was where hierarchy was clean. He was the final word here, and everyone knew it. William Brooks stood just behind him, one hand resting on the seatback, posture relaxed, but eyes sharp. 67 years old, silver hair neatly combed, the look of a man who had never needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "She's holding things up," Brooks said mildly. "That's not her place." Hargrove didn't answer right away. He adjusted his headset, then took it off again, setting it down with care. He had flown presidents, senators, CEOs who ran companies worth more than some countries. He had handled panic attacks at 30,000 feet, medical emergencies, storms that rattled bone. He had never once lost control of a cabin. "She's being difficult," Hargrove said, "whether she knows it or not." Brooks smiled thinly. "People like that usually don't." Hargrove felt a flicker of irritation at the phrasing, but let it pass. He had learned long ago not to dissect every word when the meaning was clear. The Brookses were long-term clients, loyal, predictable. The company valued that. He valued that. "I'll resolve it," Hargrove said. "We don't need operations involved." Brooks nodded. That would be best. When Hargrove stepped back into the cabin, the air felt heavier. The woman was still seated, hands folded now, eyes forward. She wasn't watching him approach. She was listening. The kind of listening that made people nervous without knowing why. Emily stood near the galley, shoulders squared, jaw set. She had stopped trembling. Fear had burned off, leaving something harder behind. Hargrove stopped beside the woman's seat, this time keeping a careful distance. "I've spoken with our clients," he said. "This seat assignment is causing unnecessary friction. I need your cooperation so we can depart." She turned her head and looked at him fully now. The light from the window caught the lines around her eyes, the faint crease between her brows. There was no softness there, only patience, stretched thin. "I'm cooperating," she said. "I'm asking for process." Hargrove exhaled slowly. He could feel eyes on them from every direction now. This was no longer a private correction. This was a standoff. "This is a chartered flight," he said. "Flexibility is part of the service." "For everyone," she replied. "Or just for some?" He stiffened. "Mom." She raised a hand, not to stop him, but to claim space. The gesture was small, controlled. It worked anyway. "I've spent my life watching men confuse convenience with authority," she said. "They look similar from the outside. They are not the same." Hargrove felt heat crawl up his neck. He did not like being psychoanalyzed by strangers. He did not like being lectured in his own aircraft. "This conversation is over," he said. "We are delaying departure. If you do not relocate, I will note non-compliance in the flight report." Emily's head snapped up. Her eyes widened. "Captain," she said carefully, "that classification requires a safety basis." Hargrove shot her a warning look. "Stand down." Emily didn't move. Her hands were steady at her sides. Her voice, when it came again, was quieter but firmer. "Respectfully, sir. That's not what the manual says." The silence that followed was different, sharper. Hargrove felt it register across the cabin like a ripple. The woman in the seat watched Emily closely. Something in her expression softened, just a fraction. Recognition again. "I would like," the woman said, "the name of the person authorizing this request." Hargrove hesitated. "My name is sufficient." She nodded. "Then please document it." For a moment, Hargrove considered calling operations. He dismissed the thought almost immediately. This did not require escalation. This required compliance. He had always handled these things himself. That was why clients trusted him. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." She met his gaze, held it. "No," she said. "I'm making it visible." Something shifted in Hargrove's chest, a faint, unwelcome sense of being watched from behind glass. He straightened abruptly. "I'm logging this," he said. "Emily." She didn't respond. "Emily," he repeated. She took a breath. "Yes, Captain." "Make a note of passenger resistance." The woman smiled then, just barely. "Spell my name correctly." Hargrove froze. He hadn't asked for it. Emily blinked. "I'm sorry, ma'am, I didn't catch." "Margaret Lewis," the woman said. Lewis. Emily's fingers paused over her tablet. Her brow furrowed, just slightly. Hargrove felt the first real jolt then. Not fear. Recognition delayed. Lewis. The name echoed faintly, tugging at something he couldn't quite place. He pushed the thought aside. "This isn't the time," he said. Margaret Lewis looked past him, toward the front of the cabin, where Caroline Brooks sat very still now, her posture rigid, eyes fixed straight ahead. "It's always the time," Margaret said. "It just rarely arrives when it's convenient." Emily glanced down at the screen again. Her breathing changed, sharper, faster. "Captain," she said softly. "What?" "The account number tied to this booking," Emily said. "It's not individual." Hargrove turned slowly. "What does that mean?" "It's corporate," Emily said, "holding level." Hargrove felt a hollow open in his stomach. Margaret watched his face carefully, the way the confidence drained, replaced by calculation. She had seen it before, the exact moment when certainty cracked. "You didn't think," she said gently, "that I came alone." Hargrove straightened, reflexively defensive. "Corporate accounts don't grant special authority." "No," Margaret said, "but they do create paper trails." Emily swallowed. "The account is tied to North Star Aviation Group." The name landed with weight. Hargrove felt the cabin tilt, just slightly, like the beginning of turbulence. North Star. The acquisition had been quiet, strategic. Executives at his level were not looped in. That was above him. That was board territory. Margaret reached into her tote, slow enough that no one mistook it for a threat. She pulled out a folded document and handed it to Emily without looking away from Hargrove. "Please add this to your report." Emily unfolded it. Her eyes widened. She inhaled sharply, then covered her mouth with her hand. "Captain," she whispered. Hargrove snatched the paper, scanning it quickly. His breath caught. Board authorization. Ownership structure. His aircraft. His company. Her signature. The cabin seemed to recede around him, the edges blurring. He felt suddenly exposed, like a man who had been speaking loudly without realizing the room had gone silent. Margaret stood slowly, not in surrender, but in command. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "I'm not moving seats," she said, "but I am taking notes." Hargrove opened his mouth, closed it again. Words failed him for the first time in decades. Behind him, William Brooks shifted uncomfortably. Caroline's face had gone pale. Margaret turned, finally acknowledging them. "You trusted the system," she said. "So did I. That's why I'm here." She looked back at Hargrove, her gaze steady, unflinching. "And this," she said quietly, "is where your flight plan changes." The cockpit door did not close right away. Hargrove stood frozen in the aisle, the folded document still in his hand, the paper suddenly heavier than any control yoke he had ever touched. Around him, the cabin held its breath. The hum of systems continued, indifferent, steady, the only thing that had not changed. Margaret Lewis remained standing, not blocking the aisle, not advancing, simply occupying space as if she had always belonged there. The confidence in her posture was quiet now, stripped of performance. This was not a reveal meant to humiliate. It was a line drawn. Emily was the first to move. She stepped forward, her tablet pressed to her chest like a shield, eyes flicking between the captain and Margaret. Her voice was careful, precise, the way she had been trained when a situation crossed from service into documentation. "Captain," she said, "per protocol, any conflict involving ownership structure requires notification of operations and temporary pause on discretionary decisions. Hargrove barely heard her. His mind was racing backward, replaying the past half hour with brutal clarity. Every word, every assumption, every moment he had chosen ease over correctness. He looked at Margaret again. Really looked this time. The plain sweater, the steady eyes, the patience that had never been weakness. "You should have said something," he muttered. Not quite accusation, not quite plea. Margaret's expression didn't change. "You didn't ask." That landed harder than any raised voice. Hargrove turned away from her and stepped into the cockpit at last, closing the door behind him with a firmness that felt rehearsed. Inside, the familiar space felt wrong now, smaller, less forgiving. He picked up the handset and dialed operations. The call connected on the second ring. "This is Captain Hargrove," he said. His voice sounded distant to his own ears. "We have a situation involving corporate ownership verification." There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice, measured, alert. "Understood. Please stand by." The word "stand by" had never felt so final. Outside, Margaret lowered herself back into her seat. Slowly, deliberately. She smoothed her slacks, set her tote at her feet again. The small ritual grounded her. She felt the eyes on her now, curious rather than dismissive, searching for clues they had missed. William Brooks cleared his throat. "This seems," he began, then stopped. His voice lacked its earlier polish. "This seems unnecessary." Margaret turned toward him, her gaze calm. "It isn't," she said. "It's overdue." Caroline Brooks shifted beside him, fingers tightening around the armrest. "We had no idea," she said, the words tumbling out too fast. "If we'd known," Margaret held up a hand, not sharply, just enough. "You knew what mattered," she said. "You knew you wanted something that wasn't yours." Silence settled again, thicker this time. Caroline looked away, color rising in her cheeks. William stared at the floor, jaw clenched. Emily retreated toward the galley, legs unsteady. Her heart was pounding now, but beneath the fear was something else. Relief. Validation. She hadn't imagined the wrongness of it. She hadn't been weak. Her tablet chimed softly. An internal message flashed across the screen. "Operations acknowledged. Delay authorized. All discretionary actions suspended." She swallowed and looked back toward Margaret. Margaret met her eyes and gave a small nod. Not approval. Gratitude. Minutes passed. Then more. The cabin door opened again. Hargrove stepped out, his face changed. Not defeated, not angry. Focused, stripped of illusion. He moved with the deliberate care of a man suddenly aware that every step mattered. He stopped beside Margaret's seat, keeping his distance. "Operations has confirmed your status," he said. His voice was level, professional. "They've instructed me to transfer command oversight pending review." Margaret inclined her head. "That's appropriate." "I'll remain in the cockpit," he continued. "But all non-essential decisions will be deferred." Emily felt her breath leave her in a rush she hadn't realized she was holding. William Brooks looked up sharply. "Deferred to whom?" "To the company," Hargrove said, "not to individual preference." Margaret didn't smile. She didn't need to. The plane did not move for another 40 minutes. During that time, the Brookses sat in silence, the weight of their earlier certainty pressing down on them. Other passengers checked their phones, sent messages, recalibrated expectations. No one complained, not out loud. Margaret used the time to observe. She noticed how Emily stayed busy, hands steady now, voice clear as she relayed updates. She noticed how the other crew members deferred to her without being told to. Small shifts, subtle, telling. When the new directive came through, it came quietly. Proceed with flight. Captain Hargrove remains. Post-flight review mandatory. Passenger accommodations to remain unchanged. Hargrove read the message twice. Then he looked up. "We're cleared," he announced. "Departure in 10. There was no applause, no release of tension, just a collective exhale. As the engines began to spool, Hargrove remained seated, hands resting lightly on his knees instead of the controls. His co-pilot handled the checklist, voice steady, eyes forward. Margaret watched the runway slide past, the city pulling away beneath them. The plane lifted smoothly, gracefully, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But everything had. At cruising altitude, Hargrove finally spoke again. "Ms. Lewis," he said over the intercom, his voice carrying through the cabin. "I want to acknowledge a failure in judgment earlier today. This flight will continue as scheduled." Margaret closed her eyes briefly. Not in triumph, in resolve. When the intercom clicked off, William Brooks leaned forward again. "I misjudged you," he said quietly. Margaret didn't turn. "You judged what you saw." He nodded once, accepting that much. Hours later, as the cabin lights dimmed and the world below dissolved into darkness, Margaret reached into her tote and pulled out her phone at last. The vibration she had ignored earlier returned, persistent. She read the message without expression. Board meeting scheduled. Review committee formed. Media inquiries pending. She set the phone down and looked toward the galley, where Emily stood speaking softly with another attendant. Her posture different now. Straighter. Surer. Margaret allowed herself one small breath of satisfaction. This was only the beginning. Not the punishment. The reckoning. The meeting room on the 38th floor smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, the kind of room designed to make people careful with their words. Margaret Lewis sat at the head of the table, hands folded, posture relaxed but alert. The city stretched behind her through the glass wall, grey and distant, like a reminder that life continued whether decisions were made or not. Around the table sat 8 people, all seasoned, all accomplished, all aware that this was not a routine review. Daniel Hargrove was the last to arrive. He entered quietly, closing the door behind him with more care than necessary. The uniform was gone. In its place, a dark suit that fit well, but not comfortably, as if he hadn't worn it in years. He took the seat indicated without comment, eyes forward, jaw set. No one spoke at first. Margaret let the silence do its work. "This is not a trial," she said at last. Her voice was steady, measured. "It's an accounting." Hargrove nodded once. Across the table, Robert Keller, head of operations, adjusted his glasses. "We've reviewed the incident report," he said, "and the historical data." He tapped a folder, thick with paper. "Minor complaints," Keller continued. "Individually inconclusive. Collectively concerning." Hargrove exhaled slowly through his nose. He had expected this, the slow unfurling of a pattern he had never bothered to see. Margaret leaned back slightly. "Tell me," she said, looking directly at him, "what you thought was happening on that plane." Hargrove hesitated. He could feel the weight of the room pressing in, the expectation of a polished answer. He chose something else. "I thought," he said, "that I was preventing a disruption." Margaret waited. "I thought," he continued, "that I was doing what I'd always done, keeping the flight smooth, keeping clients satisfied." "And when did that become your primary duty?" she asked, "instead of safety and fairness?" The words landed softly. "Precisely." Hargrove's shoulders dropped a fraction. Somewhere along the way, he admitted. It happened gradually. Margaret nodded. That's how culture decays. Quietly. At the far end of the table, a woman in her early 40s cleared her throat. Linda Morales, compliance director. She spoke rarely, but when she did, people listened. You treated discretion as entitlement, Linda said, and familiarity as permission. Hargrove didn't argue. I didn't see her, he said. Not really. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. That's the problem. The meeting lasted 2 hours. They spoke of procedures, of retraining, of corrective action, of accountability that didn't require spectacle, but demanded permanence. When it ended, the decision was unanimous. Hargrove would not be terminated. Not yet. He would be grounded, reassigned, placed under mandatory review, a chance to learn or to leave. He stood when it was over, hands resting on the back of his chair. I accept the findings, he said. All of them. Margaret held his gaze. This is not mercy, she said. It's responsibility. He nodded again, then turned and walked out, the door closing softly behind him. 2 floors below, Emily Carter sat at her desk, staring at the email on her screen. Subject line, Service Culture Review Committee. Her name was listed 3rd. She read it twice, then a 3rd time, heart pounding. When Margaret appeared at her doorway an hour later, Emily stood so fast her chair rolled backward. I didn't mean to startle you, Margaret said, stepping inside. Emily laughed nervously. I'm still getting used to surprises. Margaret smiled faintly. You handled one well. Emily swallowed. I just followed the manual. No, Margaret said. You followed your judgment. They sat, not across a desk, side by side. I need people who understand pressure, Margaret said, not just rules. Emily nodded, unsure what to say. This won't be fast, Margaret continued. You'll be challenged. You'll make mistakes. I already have, Emily said quietly. Margaret looked at her. Good. Outside the building, traffic moved in slow, deliberate lines. Somewhere above, planes crossed paths without touching. That evening, William Brooks stood in his kitchen, staring at the phone in his hand. The email was brief, polite, final. Contract discussions suspended indefinitely. Caroline watched him from the doorway, arms folded. This is because of that woman, she said. William didn't respond. She embarrassed us, Caroline insisted. William set the phone down carefully. No, he said. We embarrassed ourselves. Caroline's mouth tightened. She turned away. Back in her apartment, Margaret poured herself a glass of water and stood by the window, city lights flickering to life below. She felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet certainty that something had shifted. Her phone buzzed, a message from operations. New training protocols drafted, committee timeline attached. She read it, then set the phone aside. Somewhere across town, Hargrove sat alone in a rented car, hands gripping the steering wheel, staring at nothing. For the first time in years, he didn't know where he was headed. Above them all, the night sky remained unchanged, and the work, real work, had only just begun. The training center smelled like disinfectant and old carpet, a place built for compliance rather than comfort. Emily Carter stood at the front of the room with a dry marker between her fingers, the whiteboard behind her still clean. 12 chairs faced her. 11 were filled. Most of the faces looking back were older, guarded, skeptical. Men and women who had flown longer than she had been alive. People who knew the sky by muscle memory and did not enjoy being told how to behave in it. She felt the weight of that before she said a word. My name is Emily Carter, she began, voice steady. I'm not here to tell you how to fly. I'm here to talk about what happens when we forget who we're flying for. A man in the second row shifted, arms crossing over his chest. His name badge read Frank Delaney, 58, senior attendant. He had seen committees come and go. This another optics thing, he muttered, not bothering to lower his voice. Emily met his gaze. She didn't bristle, she didn't rush. No, she said. It's a liability thing, and a human one. That got a few heads to lift. Across town, Margaret Lewis sat in a quieter room, walls lined with binders instead of windows. Linda Morales slid a folder across the table toward her, the paper thick with tabs. 2 more complaints came in overnight, Linda said. Different flights, same pattern. Margaret opened the folder, scanning quickly. Nothing explosive. Nothing headline-worthy. The kind of behavior that hid in plain sight. We let this live too long, Margaret said. Linda nodded. Because it was convenient. At the airport, Daniel Hargrove watched a training aircraft taxi past the fence, its wings catching the light. He sat on a bench with his hands clasped, jacket folded beside him. He was not in uniform. He had not been for weeks. A young pilot jogged past, laughing with a friend, epaulets bright and clean. Hargrove looked away. He had been given assignments, paperwork, observations, a chance to learn, they said. He had spent his life teaching others how to maintain control, how to assert command without doubt. Now he was being asked to unlearn parts of himself he had mistaken for skill. He wasn't sure yet whether he could. Back in the training room, Emily clicked to the next slide. A still image of an aircraft cabin filled the screen. No labels, no annotations. I want you to tell me what you see, she said. Silence stretched. Then a woman near the aisle spoke. First-class layout, she said. High-end charter. Emily nodded. What else? Power, Frank said flatly. Money. Emily waited. And who, she asked, decides how that power moves? No one answered. That's the work, Emily said. Not enforcing comfort. Managing imbalance. The room shifted. Not dramatically, but enough. Later that afternoon, William Brooks sat across from his attorney, fingers steepled, listening as consequences were explained in calm, neutral tones. The suspension of negotiations, the cooling of relationships, the long memory of corporate boards. This will pass, the attorney said, but not quickly. William nodded. He had built his career on patience. He had just misjudged where it was required. Caroline waited in the car, sunglasses hiding her eyes. She did not look up when he opened the door. Margaret visited the hangar at dusk, the vast space echoing with distant footsteps. She walked between aircraft, hands trailing lightly along cool metal, listening to the rhythm of a place built on trust. A mechanic nodded as she passed. He did not recognize her. She liked that. Ms. Lewis. She turned to see Hargrove standing a few feet away, posture stiff, uncertain. I didn't expect to see you here, he said. I come where the problems live, she replied. He absorbed that, then nodded. I've been thinking, he said, about that day. She waited. I told myself I was maintaining order, he continued. But the truth is, I was protecting comfort. Mine, theirs. I used procedure as cover. Margaret studied him, the lines in his face deeper now, more honest. What will you do differently? She asked. He hesitated. I don't know yet. That's acceptable, she said, as long as you don't pretend you do. They stood in silence for a moment, the hangar lights humming overhead. At the training center, the session ended without applause. People filed out slowly, conversations hushed. Frank lingered, staring at the board. You handled that well, he said finally, not looking at Emily. "Thank you," she replied. He cleared his throat. "I didn't like hearing it." She smiled faintly. That means it mattered. That night, Margaret sat alone with her laptop open, news alerts blinking quietly in the corner of the screen. No headlines yet, just whispers. Analysts noticing shifts, investors asking careful questions. She drafted an internal memo, rewriting a sentence 3 times before settling on the simplest version. Respect is not discretionary. She hit send. Miles away, Hargrove sat at his kitchen table, an old flight manual open in front of him. He traced a finger along a highlighted paragraph he had never paid much attention to before. The language was plain, unassuming, clear. He closed the book. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar settle in his chest. Not shame, responsibility. And in that quiet, unglamorous realization, the true turbulence began. The first leak didn't come from a reporter. It came from a retired dispatcher in Ohio who still checked industry forums out of habit, who noticed a quiet update in a regulatory bulletin and mentioned it in a comment thread no one important was supposed to read. Within hours, the post was screenshot, shared, reframed. By morning, it had a headline. Margaret Lewis initiates culture review after in-flight dispute. Margaret read it on her tablet as her driver merged onto the freeway, the city still half asleep around them. The language was careful. No accusations, no names. But the implication was there. Something had gone wrong, and someone powerful was paying attention. She closed the article and stared out the window. This was always the moment people misunderstood. They thought exposure was the goal. It never was. Across town, Emily Carter sat at her kitchen table, coffee untouched, phone buzzing every few seconds. Messages from co-workers, from people she hadn't spoken to since training. Some supportive, some wary. One anonymous. "Careful. You're becoming a symbol." She set the phone face down and pressed her palms flat against the table, grounding herself the way Margaret had weeks earlier. She hadn't asked for visibility. She had asked for correctness. The difference mattered, even if no one else saw it yet. At headquarters, the executive floor was quieter than usual. Doors closed, conversations lowered. Margaret moved through it without stopping, her presence shifting the air around her without effort. People noticed. They always did, eventually. The emergency board session began at 10 sharp. 9 screens flickered to life around the table, faces appearing one by one. Some familiar, some guarded, all attentive. "This review," a man on the screen said early on, "is generating noise." Margaret nodded. It was always going to. "We have shareholders asking questions," another added. "They don't like uncertainty." Margaret folded her hands. "Then we should give them clarity." "By grounding a senior captain," the first man said, "you created a narrative." "No," Margaret replied. "By tolerating a pattern, we created risk." The narrative followed. Silence. Then a woman near the end of the table spoke. "You're saying the issue isn't the incident," she said. "It's the system that allowed it." "Yes," Margaret said, "and the one that hid it." The meeting ended without a vote. It didn't need one. The direction had already been set. At the airport, Daniel Hargrove stood at the edge of the runway, watching a departure he was not part of. The engines roared, the aircraft lifted, and for a moment, he felt the old instinct surge, the muscle memory, the longing. Then it passed. His phone vibrated in his pocket. A message from an old colleague. "Heard things are changing. Hang in there." Hargrove stared at the words, then slipped the phone away. Hanging in had never been his problem. Letting go was. In a conference room with no windows, Linda Morales projected a chart onto the wall. Lines intersected, dates stacked, patterns emerged. "This is what we missed," she said, pointing. "Not misconduct that explodes, misconduct that accumulates." Emily sat near the back, notebook open, pen still. She wasn't taking notes. She was watching reactions. The slight stiffening when a familiar name appeared. The way some people leaned back, arms crossed, while others leaned in. This was where culture lived. In posture. In silence. Afterward, a man approached her, mid-40s, operations. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I saw things. I didn't push." Emily nodded. "Thank you." It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. It was acknowledgement. That was enough for now. The press didn't wait. By evening, requests were flooding in. Statements, interviews, clarifications. Margaret declined them all. She issued one internal memo instead, brief and unambiguous. "We are not responding to speculation. We are correcting behavior." That night, the Brookses sat in separate rooms of their house, the television murmuring to itself. William watched a panel discuss corporate accountability, his name never mentioned, but uncomfortably close to the conversation. Caroline scrolled through her phone, jaw tight. "They're turning this into a crusade," she said aloud, though no one was listening. William didn't respond. He was thinking about the moment on the plane when certainty had cracked. How quickly it had happened. How little it had taken. At the training center, Emily locked up after a late session, the building empty now, lights dimmed. She paused in the doorway, listening to the quiet. The place felt different. Not fixed, but unsettled in a way that allowed movement. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Margaret. "Tomorrow, 8:30, my office." Emily stared at the screen, heart thudding. She typed a response, erased it, typed again. "I'll be there." Margaret received the reply as she sat at her desk, city lights stretching out beneath her like a map of decisions already made. She closed her laptop and leaned back, rubbing her temples. Change was never loud at first. It whispered. It asked questions. It made people uncomfortable before it made them better. She thought of Hargrove, of Emily, of the dozens of names in Linda's report. None of them villains. None of them innocent. Her phone rang. She answered without looking. "Yes. They're asking for a statement," her assistant said. "A stronger one." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Tell them," she said finally, "that leadership isn't about avoiding storms. It's about flying straight through them without pretending the turbulence isn't real." She ended the call and stood, walking to the window. Far below, headlights moved like veins of light through the dark. Somewhere out there, people were adjusting their understanding of power, of fairness, of who belonged where. The plane had landed weeks ago. The real flight was just beginning. The hallway outside Margaret Lewis's office was quiet in the way expensive buildings always were, insulated from urgency by design. Emily Carter stood there anyway, palms damp, spine straight, listening to the muted sounds behind the door. Voices. Low. Measured. The language of people accustomed to deciding outcomes. She had changed twice before leaving her apartment, finally settling on a simple blazer and slacks that felt like armor without pretending to be something else. The door opened. Margaret's assistant gave her a small nod and stepped aside. "She's ready." Emily walked in. Margaret Lewis stood by the window, back turned, city spread beneath her like a circuit board. She did not rush to sit. She did not gesture immediately. She finished what she was doing, then turned. "Thank you for coming," she said. Emily nodded. "Of course." They sat across from each other, the desk between them wide, but not imposing. No files, no folders, just 2 glasses of water and a legal pad turned face down. "I asked you here," Margaret said, "because visibility has a cost." Emily swallowed. "I'm starting to see that." "You will be asked to speak for things you did not create," Margaret continued. "You will be criticized for decisions you did not make. And you will be praised for restraint that will not always be rewarded." Emily listened, hands folded tightly in her lap. "I didn't plan to become part of this," she said quietly. "I just didn't want to do the wrong thing." Margaret's gaze softened. "That's how it starts." She slid the legal pad forward and turned it around. On it was a single sentence written in clean, deliberate handwriting. "Operational integrity precedes comfort." "This is not a slogan," Margaret said. "It's a standard." Emily nodded. "What do you need from me?" Margaret studied her for a long moment before answering. "I need you to stay where you are." Emily blinked. "I thought, I don't want you elevated away from the problem," Margaret said. "I want you embedded in it, observing, documenting, challenging, quietly." Emily exhaled, a mix of relief and dread. "People won't like that." "No," Margaret said. "They won't." When Emily left the office an hour later, her head was full and her chest felt tight, but her steps were steadier than when she had arrived. The hallway no longer felt like a barrier. It felt like a passage. Down the coast, Daniel Hargrove sat in a simulator bay, hands resting on his knees, eyes fixed on a screen that hadn't lit up yet. The room smelled faintly of plastic and ozone. He had spent decades teaching others how to recover from failure. Now he was here to be evaluated on whether he understood it. The instructor entered without ceremony. Younger than him, calm, efficient. "We'll start with scenario review," the instructor said. Hargrove nodded. On the screen, a cabin appeared. Familiar, uncomfortable. As the simulation unfolded, Hargrove felt something unexpected rise in him. Not defensiveness, not anger. Recognition. He watched his own decisions play out, stripped of justification, reduced to sequence. "That's where you escalated," the instructor said neutrally. Hargrove didn't argue. He leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowing. "Yes," he said. "And that's where I didn't listen." The instructor glanced at him, surprised. At North Star headquarters, the review committee convened again, this time with fewer raised voices and more data. Linda Morales moved through slides with practiced efficiency, the patterns now undeniable. "This isn't about bad actors," she said. "It's about blind spots that were rewarded." A man near the end of the table shifted uncomfortably. "People feel targeted. They feel seen," Linda replied. "There's a difference." Margaret watched quietly, saying little. This phase required space. Pressure applied without spectacle. Across town, William Brooks sat in a cafe he used to frequent daily, now visiting less often. The barista recognized him, hesitated, then smiled politely. "Same as usual," she said. William nodded, grateful for the normalcy. As he waited, he thought about the flight, the woman in the seat, the way he had assumed the system would bend, the way it hadn't. When his phone buzzed, he didn't look at it right away. Emily spent the afternoon on the floor, not in an office. She rode jump seats. She watched interactions. She noted tone more than words, the way requests were framed, the way refusals were softened or sharpened. In one cabin, a passenger raised his voice. The attendant held her ground without escalating. Emily wrote that down. In another, a crew member deferred too quickly, conceding space that didn't need to be given. Emily wrote that down too. She didn't intervene. Not yet. That evening, Margaret attended a small dinner with industry peers. No press, no speeches. just quiet conversation over carefully plated food. "You're stirring things up," a man across from her said, not unkindly. "I'm naming them," Margaret replied. He smiled thinly. "Same difference." Margaret sipped her water. "Only if you prefer comfort over accuracy." The man said nothing after that. Late that night, Hargrove left the simulator building alone. The parking lot was nearly empty, the air cool against his face. He paused beside his car, keys in hand, and looked up at the sky. He had spent his life navigating by instruments, trusting readouts, relying on systems. He had forgotten, somewhere along the way, that judgment was one of them. At home, Emily opened her laptop and reviewed her notes. Patterns were forming. Not dramatic ones, subtle ones, the kind that mattered. She typed until her fingers ached, then stopped and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. She thought of the first day on the job, the fear, the desire to disappear into correctness. She didn't feel invisible anymore. Margaret stood at her window again, city lights stretching endlessly below. Her phone buzzed with an update from Linda. "Draft policy complete. Ready for review." Margaret typed a brief response. "Send it." Change was no longer a concept. It was in motion. Slow, uneven, real. And somewhere between resistance and resolve, the culture began, quietly, to shift. The call came just after dawn, the sky outside Margaret Lewis's window still bruised with grey. She listened without interrupting, one hand resting on the sill, the city below waking in fragments. A delayed departure in Denver, a confrontation at the gate, a passenger insisting on special accommodation, invoking relationships, dropping names. A crew hesitating, uncertain which version of the rules still applied. "Let it play out," Margaret said finally. "Document everything." She ended the call and stood still for a moment, feeling the familiar pull between intervention and restraint. This was the dangerous phase. Not the crisis, but the aftermath. When people tested boundaries to see if the shift was real. At the Denver terminal, Emily Carter arrived quietly, badge clipped, coat folded over her arm. She hadn't been announced. That was intentional. She took a seat near the windows, notebook closed, eyes open. The gate area was crowded but subdued. Snow clung to the edges of the tarmac, dirty and half-melted. The aircraft waited, engines silent, crew gathered near the podium in a loose cluster. A man in an expensive coat paced in tight circles, phone pressed to his ear, voice sharp. Late 60s, confident, used to being heard. "I don't care what the system says," he snapped. "I fly this route every month. I'm not sitting there." The gate agent's smile was strained, but intact. "Sir, your seat is confirmed. I can't make changes without authorization." "Then get it," he said, jabbing a finger toward the window. "Or I will." Emily watched the exchange carefully. The agent didn't fold. She didn't escalate either. She held the line and waited. The man turned, scanning for someone else to pressure. His gaze slid past Emily without pause. Good, Emily thought. Stay invisible. The captain arrived moments later, coat dusted with snow, expression neutral. He listened as the agent explained, nodding once. "I'll speak with him," the captain said. Emily stood then, moving closer but not into the center of things. "I'm observing for operations," she said quietly, flashing her badge just long enough to register. The captain's eyes flicked to it. He nodded again, slower this time. When he approached the man, his posture was open, his voice even. "We're not changing seats," he said. "We're departing on schedule." The man scoffed. "You'll regret that." "Possibly," the captain replied. "But not today." The moment passed. The man huffed, then sank into a chair, defeated more by certainty than authority. Boarding resumed. Emily wrote nothing. She didn't need to. This one would stick. Back in New York, Margaret sat in a conference room with the lights off, screens glowing softly around the table. Linda Morales stood at the front, pointer idle in her hand. "We're seeing two types of responses," Linda said. "Quiet compliance and quiet resistance." A board member leaned forward. "And loud." "Yes," Linda said, "but that's less common." Margaret watched the data scroll past. Incidents down, reports up. Discomfort spreading in predictable pockets. "This is the slope," Margaret said. "If we hold it, it flattens. And if we don't," another member said. "Then we slide back," Margaret replied. In the simulator bay, Daniel Hargrove completed his final evaluation run. The scenario ended, the screen dimmed, and the instructor removed his headset. "You corrected faster this time," the instructor said. Hargrove nodded, sweat cooling on his neck. "I saw it sooner." "That matters," the instructor said. Hargrove sat back, breathing deeply. He wasn't fixed. He wasn't forgiven. But he was present. Later, as he walked out into the cold, his phone buzzed with a message from operations. "Reinstatement pending. Conditional." He stared at the screen, then slipped the phone away without responding. Conditional was fair. Conditional was earned. In Denver, Emily boarded the aircraft last, taking the jump seat without ceremony. As the door closed, she felt the familiar hum beneath her feet, the vibration that meant forward motion. She thought of Margaret's words, embedded, observing, challenging quietly. At cruising altitude, the captain came back briefly, checking on the cabin. His eyes met Emily's. He gave a small nod. Professional, respectful. Emily returned it. In the Brooks household, the television murmured as William Brooks sorted through old files, preparing for a meeting that might not happen. Caroline watched him from the doorway, arms crossed. "They're making an example," she said. "They're setting a standard," William replied. She scoffed. Same thing. William didn't answer. He had learned, finally, the cost of confusing the two. Margaret ended her day in the same place she often did now, standing at the window, watching planes trace quiet arcs across the sky. Each one carried 100 small decisions she would never see. Her phone chimed. Update from Denver attached. She read it once, then again. No incident logged, procedure followed, departure on time. She closed her eyes briefly, exhaling. This was the work. Not dramatic, not clean, but real. Across the country, Emily stepped off the plane into cold air, her breath visible, her notebook still closed. She felt tired in a good way, the kind that came from holding a line without being seen. Behind her, the aircraft was already being prepped for its next flight, crews moving with quiet efficiency, unaware of the weight they carry. And above it all, the sky remained wide, indifferent, waiting for those who had finally learned how to move through it without leaving damage behind. The first resignation came in quietly, slipped into an inbox at 6:12 in the morning. Subject line neutral, tone professional. Margaret Lewis read it without surprise. She had been expecting this phase. Not outrage, not lawsuits. Attrition. The slow shedding of people who had thrived in the gaps between rules, who mistook flexibility for entitlement and clarity for threat. She forwarded the message to Linda Morales with a single line. Log it. No response yet. Across the country, Emily Carter sat in a small hotel room, suitcase still unopened, the curtains drawn just enough to let in the dull light of a rainy afternoon. She had spent the morning on 3 flights, 4 jump seats, and 1 long layover watching the same pattern repeat itself in subtle variations. Crew members hesitating before denying a request. Passengers testing boundaries with practiced smiles. Authority no longer automatic, but negotiated. It was exhausting. It was working. Her phone buzzed on the bedside table. A text from an unknown number. Heard you're the reason things are changing. She stared at it for a moment, then typed back. No, I'm just writing it down. She set the phone aside and leaned back against the headboard, closing her eyes. The hum of the air conditioner reminded her faintly of an aircraft at idle. Waiting. Ready. At North Star headquarters, the board reconvened for what had been labeled a routine update. The word routine did a lot of work these days. Linda stood again, charts projected behind her, voice steady. We're seeing a measurable shift, she said. Incident escalation is down. Reporting accuracy is up. Turnover has increased by 12% in specific departments. A man near the center of the table frowned. That's not ideal. It's necessary, Margaret said. He turned toward her. We're losing experienced people. We're losing misaligned ones, Margaret replied. There's a difference. The room absorbed that. Later that afternoon, Daniel Hargrove sat in a quiet office with a view of a tarmac he was not yet cleared to walk onto. The conditional reinstatement paperwork lay open on the desk in front of him. Pages of language, clauses, expectations. He read them slowly, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. When he reached the final page, he didn't sign right away. He sat back, hands folded, staring out the window at a jet easing into its gate. For the first time in his career, returning to the cockpit felt like a privilege rather than a right. He picked up the pen and signed. In Denver, Emily attended a debrief that stretched longer than planned. Voices overlapped, opinions surfaced that had been buried for years. Not anger, fatigue. A senior attendant spoke up near the end, her voice tight. We're tired of guessing what the company wants from us. Emily nodded. So are we. Silence followed. That's why we're writing it down, Emily continued. So you don't have to guess. So the answer is the same tomorrow as it is today. The woman exhaled, tension draining from her shoulders. Others nodded. Clarity, Emily thought, was a form of kindness. That evening, William Brooks sat alone in his study, the room lined with awards and photographs from a life built on access. He held one picture in his hand longer than the others. A younger version of himself shaking hands with someone important, smiling confidently into a future that had always seemed predictable. His phone rang. He answered without looking at the screen. Yes? The voice on the other end was polite, distant, final. William listened. He did not interrupt. When the call ended, he set the phone down gently, as if sudden movement might shatter something. He did not tell Caroline that night. Margaret ended her day in the same way she had begun it, alone with data. She reviewed memos, scanned reports, tracked names moving between columns. Resigned, reassigned, retained. One name appeared again and again in positive margins. Carter, Emily. Margaret closed the file and leaned back, allowing herself a rare moment of reflection. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something quieter. Recognition. She typed a brief message. When you're back in New York, we should talk. Emily read it in an airport lounge, the noise around her fading as she stared at the screen. She typed a reply, erased it, typed again. Anytime. The next morning, a flight departed on schedule from a small regional airport. Nothing remarkable about it except what didn't happen. No raised voices, no whispered complaints, no quiet bending of rules. The captain followed procedure. The crew followed training. The passengers followed instructions. It made no headlines. That afternoon, Hargrove walked onto the tarmac for the first time in weeks, badge reactivated, uniform pressed. He paused for a moment before boarding, hand resting briefly on the fuselage. He did not feel redeemed. He felt accountable. In a conference room miles away, Linda pinned a new document to the board. Final draft. Approved. Respect is not discretionary. She stepped back and smiled faintly. Emily landed in New York after dark, city lights blinking beneath her like signals. She felt the familiar fatigue settle into her bones, deeper now, but steadier, the kind that came from alignment rather than fear. As she walked down the jet bridge, a crew member she didn't recognize nodded at her with something like respect. Not deference, not gratitude. Recognition. Margaret watched another plane cross the skyline from her office window, its path smooth, uninterrupted. She thought of the seat on that first flight, the moment that had set everything else in motion. The change had not been loud. It had been persistent. And it was no longer fragile. The morning Margaret Lewis returned to the training center, the building felt different. Not quieter, not calmer, just steadier, like a structure that had settled after a long, overdue shift. The smell was the same, disinfectant and old carpet, the fluorescent lights unchanged, but the people moved through the space with less hesitation. They knew what was expected now. That knowledge carried weight. Emily Carter was already there. She stood near the back of the main room, watching a group of attendants review a new service protocol on their tablets. No one looked at her with suspicion anymore. No one deferred to her unnecessarily either. They nodded when she passed. They asked questions. They waited for answers. Margaret observed from the doorway, unnoticed, and allowed herself a moment to take it in. This was the part that never made headlines. The quiet recalibration of behavior once the noise faded. Emily noticed her and walked over, posture relaxed, eyes alert. "You didn't announce yourself," Emily said. Margaret smiled faintly. "I wanted to see what happens when no one is performing." "And," Emily asked, "what did you see?" "Work," Margaret said. "The real kind." They walked together down the corridor, past classrooms and offices where conversations continued without stopping for them. That mattered more than any formal greeting. In one room, a senior attendant spoke firmly but respectfully to a trainee who had hesitated during a simulated conflict. In another, a pilot reviewed a checklist aloud, pausing to confirm understanding instead of assuming it. Margaret stopped briefly, watching. "None of this existed on paper before," Emily said. "People thought it did, but it didn't." Margaret nodded. Most cultures survive on assumptions until someone removes them. Later that afternoon, Daniel Hargrove entered the building quietly. He wore his uniform again, but it fit differently now. Not in fabric, but in meaning. He moved through the space without the old certainty, without the unconscious expectation of deference. He greeted people by name. He listened more than he spoke. When he saw Margaret, he stopped. "Ms. Lewis," he said. Margaret met his gaze. "Captain." They stood for a moment, neither rushing to fill the space. "I wanted you to know," Hargrove said. "I'm grateful I wasn't dismissed outright." Margaret considered him carefully. "I didn't keep you because of your past," she said. "I kept you because of your response to it." He accepted that without argument. "I won't waste it," he said. "I know," Margaret replied. In a quiet office nearby, Linda Morales finalized the last set of compliance metrics, her fingers moving steadily over the keyboard. The data told a story now. Not a perfect one, but a clear one. Incidents were down. Reporting was consistent. Escalations followed documented paths instead of personal instincts. Systems, when respected, created room for humanity instead of crushing it. That evening, Margaret attended a small gathering at headquarters. No speeches, no podium. Just employees from different departments, sharing food and cautious conversation. It wasn't celebratory. It was transitional. A maintenance supervisor spoke about feeling heard for the first time in years. A dispatcher described how much easier it was to do her job without guessing which rule would be bent for whom. Margaret listened. She spoke little. Across town, William Brooks sat in his study, boxes stacked neatly by the door. The house felt larger now, emptier. The symbols of certainty he had once relied on no longer reassured him. He reread an email he hadn't responded to yet, the language careful, professional, closed. He didn't feel wronged. He felt corrected. It took him longer than he expected to accept that distinction. Back at the training center, Emily packed up her things as the day ended. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone no longer bracing for impact. She had not become the face of change. She had become part of its infrastructure. Margaret found her by the exit. "You don't need me here anymore," Margaret said. Emily paused. "That sounds like success." "It is," Margaret replied. "And it means I'll be stepping back." Emily absorbed that. "What happens next?" Margaret looked around the building one last time. "Now the system has to prove it can hold without me." They stood together in silence for a moment, the hum of distant aircraft faint through the walls. As Margaret walked to her car, she felt the familiar pull of the sky above her. Not ownership, not control, just movement. She thought back to the seat on that first flight, the moment of pressure, the choice not to yield quietly, the choice to document instead of disappear. It had never been about humiliation. It had never been about power. It had been about refusing to let small injustices pass as normal. That night, a flight crossed the country without incident. The crew followed procedure. The passengers followed instruction. The captain followed the plan. No one noticed. And that was the point. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like it, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more stories where quiet accountability leads to real change.